You got to get the defibrillator and like put it to the chest of the Ordinals protocol and hope that there's something that can kind of bring it back to life.
Beezy, welcome to the pod. Welcome to Bitcoin Rails. I'll give like a brief introduction of who you are for folks who might not know. So you were a research analyst at Galaxy, which I actually don't think that many people really understand the relevance of Galaxy, especially in the early Ordinals days. You were really kind of the first folks to be putting out analytics and sort of institutional level reports about the Ordinals ecosystem in 2023. You were doing this?
Yep.
Okay, and you've been pretty deep in Ordinals ever since, and behind many a research analytics pseudonym as well that we won't get into too much depth about. But yeah, I mean, I think it's arguable to say that you're sort of one of the deepest researchers in the Ordinal space, which is why I think you'd be the perfect person to get into this Ordinals therapy session with. We need to talk about what happened, what's happening, what's going to happen in the Ordinals ecosystem right now. A lot of uncertainty, a lot of pain, a lot of cope. And yeah, I think that that's probably the best place for us to start from your analytics perspective. I'm going to open up the very broad question and ask, what happened with Ordinals? What happened? We're all here. We've had the sort of pretty disappointing 8 to 9 months, I would say, since the halvening in March. What's your take? And yeah, what do you think went wrong?
Yeah, that is such a loaded question. I think there's a number of things to really touch on within that broader question. I think we can probably start with going back pre-halving when ordinals were really, that was probably an all-time high for the space. I think you had node monk sales for like aliens in the 10 Bitcoin range. I think the floor was around 1 Bitcoin. OMBs were doing very well. So you had floor prices up, all-time highs. Everything looked like it was great. There was a lot of hype and anticipation, I think, going into the halving, just with Bitcoin price and other things that were going on. But I think the big focus was on runes, right, at the end of the day. And so I think that
Leading into the
halving. And so when I kind of think of that blow off top moment for inscriptions at the end of the day, I think a lot of it was a result of anticipation of the Runes protocol that was ultimately going to be going live at the halving, at the halving block. And people just ultimately trying to get liquidity ready to be able to mint and launch new tokens, trade these tokens. There was a ton of money that ultimately left the Ordinals, I would say, ecosystem to get ready to participate in runes. And I think that was sort of the beginning of sort of the longer, I'd say, downtrend that we've seen for Ordinals as a whole. And we can even unpack sort of what even transpired with runes, because there's a lot on that front as well. But there was certainly a lot of money that was spent in fees, right? And then I think the one big thing was there was just so much hype and anticipation. A lot of people really anticipated runes being this order of magnitude improvement over BRC20s from a UX perspective. That was not the case. And I don't know if there's anyone necessarily to blame for like maybe the miscommunication with respect to what was being delivered versus the expectation. But I think that caused a massive roadblock. And then runes really didn't take off the way that people anticipated. And so there wasn't really this giant wealth creation event that could have ultimately found its way back into the ordinal space. It was just a lot of trapped liquidity that has just been kind of down only since that time period. And I think it's caused a lot of suffering across the entire sort of ordinals, runes, landscape, if you will.
100%. And I think that we're going to sort of get into the relationship between sort of the runes downtrend, what sparked the runes downtrend, and its sort of ultimate implications for ordinals and the rest of the Bitcoin native assets space. Prior to, I mean, that was really sort of like the last downward catalyst, right, was the halvening. Prior to that, though, we did have a couple sort of ups and downs in the Ordinals ecosystem. Runes didn't exist, so it was just the Ordinals ecosystem that were consistently followed by explosive uptrends afterwards. And I think that, folks were also sort of assuming, I know I was for several months after the halvening, this is just a normal downtrend. Bitcoin's down post-halvening as miners are capitulating. This is going to reverse. And of course, we've all seen Bitcoin did reverse and Ordinals did not come with it. So something was different about this downtrend than previous kind of mini cycles within the Ordinals ecosystem. So let's sort of dive into a little bit of sort of the challenges with Runes really quickly. So why do you think Runes didn't take off?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple big reasons. One, I think that there were some key design decisions that really kind of held the protocol back. I think the first one is just the choice with respect to the tickers and having to sort of only do, I think it's 20 or 23 character tickers, which is
It was at
kind of
least
challenging.
13.
Yeah,
I don't
it's
even know.
long.
The
I
fact
don't
that we
even
don't
know.
even
It's
know
really
is a
long.
problem. Yeah.
So it kind of only really caters to a US based demographic where a lot of the meme coins or tokens out there are like US based sort of jokes or insiders. It would be really, really difficult to really translate the names of a lot of those meme coins into other sort of languages. So it kind of fragments the potential investor base or, the virality, if you will, of
Wait,
some of the memes.
China was never going to get in on like a bunch of
100%.
13-bit tickers,
Absolutely.
basically.
Absolutely. And that's a big issue as well, is like when you look at the success of BRC20s, it was really the Chinese liquidity and the Chinese based investors that really drove a lot of the hype and sort of volume that we saw. Right. The meme during that time was like the Chinese grandmas or they're buying your bags or what have you. But China really drove a lot of that attention. I think that that's one of the reasons why you saw marketplaces like OKX and Binance so quick to also respond with respect to listing BRC20s, is because they saw that those investors in the Asian market were really keen on that. And that's something that was not and has not been the case with Runes. And we still don't have a Binance listing to date, right? For any rune out there, it's been a very, very stark contrast from a listing and adoption perspective with the exchanges between BRC20s and runes. So I think that that's one of the reasons. I think other design considerations are, you know, uh, the fact that it's really not as big of an improvement over BRC20s as you would think. Like the biggest issue with BRC20s when you're trading on chain is that you could easily brick floors. That's something that still exists with runes and is one of the biggest hurdles. The concept of splitting runes is still a massive friction point.
It's really not that different than
It's not.
transfer
It's
inscriptions.
yeah, exactly. It's really no different. It's just kind of a different flavor, but of the same variety. And that's been a massive challenge, I think, from just an onboarding type of perspective. Then you also had the sniping issue, right? That also made it difficult. So when you think about people trying to mint things and just the opportunity cost of missing out because your transaction got sniped, is definitely a big barrier to entry, especially for people that were not accustomed to that. And I think that that's something else that needs to be said, even with respect to inscriptions, is the whole, mempool sniping thing, I think was a big deterrent. I think it's kind of been mostly fixed now, but it's something that contributed. And then I also think the fact that the Runes protocol at the end of the day was never really meant to be a commercial sort of token standard or protocol on Bitcoin. Casey's motivation, as he said, was really just to destroy BRC20s because he didn't like how inefficient it was and felt like it was spam. But the motivation for Runes wasn't really from a place of like, let me go build the best sort of token protocol to go compete with ERC20s or Solana based tokens, right? It was totally just a knee jerk response. And as a result, I personally feel I like love Casey, but personally, I feel like he just kind of delivered like an unfinished product and was like, here you go, do with it what you will. I don't really care about this. It's all just kind of a joke to me. And that's fine. But the issue is that you being Casey and understanding sort of the influence that you have, people are going to look at everything that you produce and take it very seriously, and they're going to approach it from a commercial standpoint, and people ultimately are going to look at it from the standpoint of trying to make money. And so ideas like coin pools or other ways that you could potentially make the protocol maybe a little bit more flexible from like a expressivity standpoint, or with respect to making it more programmable, where you could alleviate some of the big frictions. Casey doesn't have any interest, right, in really doing these things. Like even the idea or notion that you can take runes and move them on Lightning as a way to potentially provide, faster transactability. He has no intentions of doing any work with respect to supporting those things. So he basically gave the community an unfinished product, said, "This is your burden. Go figure it out. I don't care." And we've kind of had to wrestle with that, which I think has been a little bit challenging and made it tougher from an adoption standpoint.
Do you think that people kind of went forward with Runes Mania simply because they felt like they missed the BRC20 trade and this was going to be the new hot thing? Like, why do you think everyone sort of drank this Kool-Aid that, I mean, to your point, I don't think Casey ever said this is like a really great protocol. And he was very upfront that his intention for creating Runes was to make a protocol that was less pollutive to Bitcoin L1, not to make a protocol that was actually good for users or actually solved commercial problems. Why do you think there was such a like jumping on the bandwagon of this so violently, such to the extent that people were like effectively abandoning BRC20, which at that point was inarguably the most important asset propping up the entire Ordinals ecosystem?
hmm
What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it a lot of it stems from what would I say? I think it's really the narrative at the end of the day. It's sort of like this idea of tokens on Bitcoin, right? And when people think about, it's so easy to do these like relative comparisons of just the size of the token market, if you will, on like Ethereum. Like what is the TAM of ERC20s on Ethereum, and then the TAM of tokens on Solana, and you look at the size of what those represent, and then you think about the fact that Runes could present this first opportunity to have a legitimate sort of token ecosystem or market on Bitcoin. That total addressable market is a massive number, right? If you're just doing those very simple relative comparisons, saying that, if the token market is 10% of Bitcoin's total market value, it's a really large number. And there's a lot of opportunity to make money, both from potentially trading the tokens or building the infrastructure, what have you. So I think it was that dream, that vision, that narrative that really drew a lot of people into Runes at the start. And I mean, I still think to this day, right? Like tokens on Bitcoin is still like a big idea. It's still a big TAM. I just think that we have a lot more work to do on the Bitcoin side to find what is ultimately going to be the winning or competing protocol. And then certainly BRC20 really came out of left field. No one was anticipating it. There was, it was just kind of like, hey, like Domo was like, hey, I built this thing. It exists now. You can play with it if you want. And that's kind of what it was. And it was this massive wealth creation event for anyone that really participated, especially if you got Ordi. Anyone that ended up minting Ordi did incredibly well for themselves. And a lot of people saw that wealth creation event or benefited from it directly and just thought that Runes was going to be that times 10. So I think that's a lot of what we saw.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think when we spoke about this off camera, but everyone was hoping that this would be their BRC20 moment. But what actually really sort of made BRC20 was the fact that there was no lead up and the trade was not crowded. That's why people made money. Runes was the most crowded trade literally of all time. I mean, like everyone from every ecosystem literally knew that day, okay, let's go mint some runes and who you're going to sell your bags to. So, I mean, I have so many questions re the like Runes BRC20 conversation. And I also obviously want to get back into ordinals. Before I do that, though, I will say, so BRC20 is a very different, the team, the BRC20 core team, Domo, Best in Slot, et cetera, have a very different sort of disposition, I would say, towards developing token standards than Casey does, right? Casey's sort of actively hostile towards the idea of, programmability or, expressive contracts on Bitcoin, et cetera. Do you think that BRC20, do you think that this sort of BRC 2.0, kind of effort to make BRC20 programmable could potentially revive BRC20? Or do you see BRC20 as sort of like a casualty in this whole situation?
I think it's possible, but I would put it as a very low probability event. I mean, I would love to see BRC 2.0 like succeed. Like I just want to see something succeed. So I would honestly, but I
Please
think
God.
that the runes overhang
Is bad.
is so bad that it probably does impact BRC 2.0's like launch. Um, and I almost think with respect to a token standard on Bitcoin, it's actually a really interesting time because um, now's the time. Like if you're Lightning Labs and you're working on Taproot Asset Protocol, now's the time. Like honestly, if I were them, or like Domo, I'd be attacking runes aggressively. I would be saying like, look, here's all the problems, here's all the issues.
Here's why we're
These
fixing.
things aren't going to be fixed anytime soon. Here's the protocol that we're working on. Here's how it addresses all of these issues that people trading runes have had. We're actually receptive to feedback. We want to make this work. Use our tech and tell us what you want to see, and we're going to build and ship. That's what I would be doing if I'm Domo and it's the layer one foundation, right?
Yep.
If I'm the layer one foundation, if I'm Taproot Asset Protocol, even if I'm on RGB, if I'm building any kind of competing token protocol right now, I think that it's the best opportunity to be actively marketing your protocol. Before, closer to the halving, I would have said, there's too much mind share on runes. I don't think that any other protocol would have really been able to have a chance just because of how much focus and attention and money was ultimately being thrown at runes. Now I think it's a wide open race and it's ultimately going to take some time for that to kind of figure itself out. But that's kind of how I personally see the landscape right now.
It's interesting. I think so many people kind of forget how important BRC20 was in the development of the Ordinals ecosystem in the first place, going back to these sort of like mini cycles and Ordinals that we had leading up to the halvening, the launch of BRC20, the creation of BRC20, and specifically already getting listed on centralized exchanges, et cetera, was the catalyst for basically the second and third wave of ordinals, rises, which is probably a good segue to talk about also the importance of centralized exchanges and the roles that they're playing in this sort of Bitcoin native asset situation that we're in. Trevor Owens was on the show somewhat recently saying, don't worry, dog is coming. I mean, he didn't explicitly reference dog, but he said, runes will be picked up by exchanges, by centralized exchanges. And we're going to have centralized SEX liquidity for Bitcoin native assets, maybe not imminently, but soon. That was sort of his thesis. What do you think about that?
I think he's probably right. I mean,
Right.
honestly, I do. I mean, I think that there are definitely some exchanges considering like how to support runes or provide support. I wouldn't be shocked if like a Kraken ended up providing support for runes,
Like for dog or
for
something.
dog or some of the bigger ones. I just think that it's really sort of like the opportunity cost of time, right? So much time has already gone on that people are so down bad on runes and there's so much attention that's been lost. I'm not sure that a centralized exchange listing is able to just completely cause a 180 or reversal, right? To kind of like re-jumpstart like attention, liquidity or what have you for runes, right? And again, like if it takes another 6 months, right, to get a centralized exchange listing, like all these things might be at zero. Like there are projects seriously considering bridging to other chains now. I mean, like the vibes in the space are really, really bad. Almost feels like runes are kind of on life support. If you just look at the volume, it's abysmal. There's nothing in sight that's going to materially change the UX, right? There's zero catalyst.
I think the runes flippening has already flipped back. So there was a point when dog flipped Ordi, and now Ordi has gone back to flipping.
The BRC20s might be doing more volume than runes. They
definitely are.
The numbers, but
They
I'm pretty sure
100% are. Yeah, they 100%.
which is wild, right? with no real enhancements because all the work's still on.
I think one of the biggest problems, and this is my personal opinion, but I think one of the biggest like hindsight blind spots was that people underestimated how important BRC20 was in propping up the entire ecosystem, and to have this event that like was basically seen as an opportunity to beat BRC20 and sort of like PvP vibe with BRC20. Really ended up shooting everyone in the foot. I mean, we've talked about this ad nauseum offline as well. This sort of liquidity fragmentation issue is probably like the core issue of what really happened at the halvening. I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I can try to touch on that. With respect to, if you just think about, you almost have to kind of break it down to like who kind of trades these assets, like who trades ordinals, who trades sort of like runes, BRC20s. When I kind of think about that pool of capital, it's relatively small. It's actually pretty small, at the end of the day. It's all the same people. The people that are trading ordinals are the same people trading BRC20s and the same people trading runes. And so you're taking this small pool of capital, especially if you're comparing it to the amounts of money and number of investors that are trading meme coins on Solana or are trading like ERC20s or Ethereum NFTs. Ordinals is so tiny with respect to just the sheer number of players. And so when you introduced runes, like BRC20 already, like it also kind of fragmented the liquidity. There was sort of like the first like ordinals are dead moment. And I think that came sort of shortly after BRC20s, but it was a function of people just kind of rotating, right? It's like the rotation trade. So people stop trading ordinals to go trade BRC20s, hopefully make money there. And then that actually did happen. It played out. Yeah. And then you saw a lot of that money kind of flow back into ordinals, right? With respect to the blue chips, the assets that people really want and value, and kind of respect, you saw the money kind of flow back into those assets, which kind of restarted the second bull market for the ordinals. And then with each time you kind of have that event, it kind of does help to attract new people to come into the space, whether it's new artists, whether it's new collectors. But at the end of the day, it's an attention game, and the easiest way to get attention is by seeing number go up, just quite simply.
This is really key, that there was, and I think this is important, there actually was a catalyst
100%
after BRC20. And I would argue that the catalyst for that last up wave that we've seen before this seemingly downward only spiral was node monks and puppets. Node monks, like sort of like the wave of 10Ks, right? Like the liquid ordinal pumps, right? Because prior to that, it was, you had a lot of these sort of like luxury collections that only kind of more like pretty wealthy, collectors were trading, like the rocks and the, that kind of thing. But puppets and node monks was a big catalyst, and that I think was sort of where a lot of the the BRC20 winnings ended up rotating into those. Do you think that there's any catalyst on the table that we could hope or pray for at this point? I mean, this is the real question, is like, what's left to bring money back into the ecosystem? Like,
that's truly $1 million question. I think, man, I want to say there's still a chance, right? I mean, like, it's been very, very tough for a lot of those collections. They're down substantially from their all-time highs in terms of floor price. I just kind of look at it where like you almost just have to rebootstrap, honestly, unfortunately. But I feel like that's kind of where we're at. I think that we had this sort of immaculate inception sort of moment in time with the launch of the Ordinals protocol and how it caught fire and the adoption and sort of all the momentum it had. Runes, in my opinion, completely derailed all of the momentum. That's just point blank. how I see it. Just, I own Runes. Like, I'm fudding my own bags, but like, Runes completely destroyed the show. And now I kind of look at the space and I see it as like, it's gotta bootstrap itself. It's kind of like you got to get the defibrillator and like put it to the chest of the Ordinals protocol and hope that there's something that can kind of bring it back to life. I think it's sort of an example of how like greed kills in a sense, because I think a lot of what we saw with Runes and the activity, the narratives, the hype was tremendous greed, right? That ultimately led to what could be the bigger demise of Ordinals to a degree. I mean, I still think that there's a lot of like the benefit for Ordinals is that I do think it's a truly differentiated protocol, and it did really bring something new to the table as far as digital collectibles go. And when we think about like just digital art, on-chain art, like Ordinals really is unique. And so I think what we really need to do is just focus on our strength, right? Like what made Ordinal special, what made like sort of assets on Bitcoin unique. We need to lean back into that and work on sort of regrowing those things, playing to that narrative, right? Like just playing to our strengths. Meme coins and tokens is not a strength of Bitcoin.
And
It's
it
just
never
not a
will
strength.
be.
And it probably never will be. And so I understand that like that TAM looks massive, but it's sort of it's like a fool's errand, right? It's sort of like a trick or a fallacy to a degree. And it's something that could happen, but I think it's probably like a next cycle thing, maybe. Like there's a lot more that I think has to occur from like an infrastructure standpoint. Maybe you even need a soft fork. Who knows if we'll get one to be able to make the tech more viable and competitive with other chains.
For tokens.
For tokens. But Ordinals are competitive today and don't need any of those.
They're already better than
already
NFTs
better.
anywhere else. Yeah.
So I think we just need more of our community mind share to come back to look at, hey, there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit here with Ordinals. There's a lot of things that could be done. There's a lot of things that haven't yet been explored. Let's get back to our roots and continue building on what has worked. Yeah. That's what I think. That would be my pitch.
So, yeah, so I think you've said this now, Owl's said this now, Udi has said this now, right? We're, you know, attention, not only liquidity, but attention amongst developers, amongst users, amongst investors has been sort of really split between Ordinals and Runes. And the reality of the situation is that Runes are a suboptimal token protocol. The only thing that makes them special is that they're on Bitcoin, but from a UX perspective, they're actually like very difficult and clunky. Ordinals, on the other hand, not only are they on Bitcoin, but they actually have properties that make them more interesting and more viable than NFTs on Ethereum. Let's focus on Ordinals. Ordinals is the thing that we're actually good at. Let's drop the thing that we're not that good at and refocus is sort of the message I'm hearing from you, and something that's been mirrored by some pretty important influencers in this space. Most notably, Owl and Udi have really been, you know, chiming the bells here. What would you say to someone who is really resisting this message, right? Like somebody who's obviously carrying really heavy bags of runes here and, you know, is super triggered, you know, fighting back against Owl and Udi when they're like, hey, guys, just let it go. Let the runes go. We're gonna, you know, we've got to focus on Ordinals or we're gonna lose it all. What would you say to the person who's resistant to that message?
Man, what would I say? I would probably try to make the argument that what is the phrase? It's like throwing the baby out with the bathwaters. It almost kind of feels like that, where it's like if we continue to double down here on runes, in my opinion, I think you seriously run the risk of just having everything like go to zero, right? Like it's you know what I mean? Like that's kind of my personal view. So I kind of look at it like I'd rather like recognize a sunk cost, basically, is kind of how I look at it. I think runes are a sunk cost, right? I think we should all try to refocus resources, effort, you know, whoever's still here and still cares about ordinals, right? Like we just need to come together and kind of focus on the things that we still have going for us, where we do feel we have a competitive advantage, and do that. And I think if you don't, you sort of run the risk of a continued sort of downtrend and bleed out that ultimately just results in everyone leaving the space and never coming back. And then everyone loses, right? And I think that that's a real risk. I think that's a real risk right now, for this space. Like I personally would love to see even like Wrath, Casey, and the core team focus a lot more on ordinals development and thinking about what can we do to make the ordinals protocol better, and spend less time on runes, right? I mean, even within the context of knowing that runes is really just like a fun little pet project anyway, let's just focus on what's working then, right? If you're not making money from it and it was all just for fun, it was an experiment, we tried it, it is what it is. Let's get back to the real bread and butter at the end of the day.
Right. And perhaps they would say, ordinals is pretty ossified or close to ossified at this point, but the influence they have and the leadership that they have, is so huge. It would be great to see them supporting development efforts, builder efforts. I mean, this was, I think, was a super important point you made earlier, which is that it wasn't just the liquidity that that was fragmented. We lost developer talent in the Ordinals ecosystem to runes. And that, was just sort of a momentum killer. So on the infra side of things, what would it mean to refocus on ordinals and rebootstrap ordinals? Like, tangibly, what does that mean? What would you like to see more of in the ordinals ecosystem, or more coming back to of in the ordinals ecosystem?
Sure. So I think there's a number of things, which some could be, more of a focus for like the core ordinal team. Some are just going to be third-party development. But I think those big buckets are, one, we need like cold storage solutions. I know that's kind of out of the hands of many in the community, but I still think that we could actively push groups like Trezor, Ledger, Foundation Devices. Hey, we need a cold storage solution for ordinals, and letting them know that there's a lot of demand for such a product, and that if they were to work with the community or provide support, they're able to expose their products to a large consumer base that would certainly buy their products. I think, for anyone that owns like a JPEG, like a shroom that, is worth maybe a Bitcoin or something like that, doesn't feel great holding that in a hot wallet. I think also for any potential like family office or institutional capital that might be even remotely interested in trading any of these assets, they need a cold storage solution. I also look at sort of petitioning groups like a Coinbase Custody, BitGo, Fireblocks. They all provide institutional custody solutions for NFTs. Zero support for ordinals. I know it's early, but I think we need more of that. I also think we need way better curatorial tools and explorers for art. I know Gamma is taking a stab at this, but and they're actively working. There's a couple other groups, but I think that there's a lot more work that could be done with respect to even creating sort of like labels for inscriptions, so that you could almost have like better searching and filtering for data that actually lives on Bitcoin. And there's some interesting projects already, but just continuing to push the boundary forward there. I think there's a big opportunity there. More efforts to just help artists be discovered. I'd also love to see, there's no like frames, like digital art frames that have native ordinal support. There's like 12 different companies that support NFTs with respect to digital art frames. So that would be huge for in-person or IRL like exhibitions, right? It would be great if we had digital frames where we could go and try to talk to groups like Bitcoin Park or PubKey, right? And see if they would be open to like just even showing like various art collections that live on Bitcoin in those spaces. If you had that, you could even maybe talk to those groups about doing exhibitions. But I think like that is a big element of helping to further the art narrative, the art story, and allowing collectors to be able to showcase their work. which is really important. We could certainly have more wallets, right? I think the big issue, and love Xverse, I'm rocking the Xverse tee. Shout out Jan.
Shout out.
But you really only have 2-3 wallet choices, right? It would be great to have more. We know that a lot of the Bitcoin like maxi oriented companies are probably not going to provide support. That's okay. It would be great, but more options, right? Just making it easier for people to have sort of more flexibility and choice, I think would be great. Then I think also like ordinals.com as an explorer, there's a lot of low hanging fruit there.
That's a Casey thing.
That's a Casey thing.
Casey,
but like,
there's a lot that could
there's
be
a
done
lot
by
that
the
you could
core
do,
team to
but like
make this
you
cool.
could have grants, right? We could have grants to just say, hey, like help design a UX for this. And with that, there's like a lot more we could do with parent-child in terms of how that's displayed on Explorers. There's rare sets, and there's a lot more discovery. And I think, you know, like work that could go into like the rare set narrative. All of these great things.
I'm literally getting nostalgic as you're talking, because these are the things we used to talk about.
100%.
These are the things we cared about in 2023, early 2024.
This unique.
100%. Like these were the interesting, cool, like subject matters, right? Like this was it. And it's sort of like the ecosystem devolved in this like gambling degeneracy vibe when Bitcoin is really not suited to like gambling level degeneracy. It's suited to creating the most pristine, you know, kind of censorship resistant, like immutable, lasting forever assets, you know, like really, really high quality value assets. And obviously, if you speak to Casey, and I know you've heard him say this, he made Ordinals because he wanted to create the best effectively NFT protocol for art, for generative art.
100%. That's the difference, though. That statement right there. He wanted to create the best NFT protocol across all chains. All chains.
That's right.
The motivation behind his creation of the Ordinals protocol, fundamentally different from what it was from Runes.
Right.
And like that makes all the difference.
Right, right. With Runes, his motivation was get rid of BRC20, you know, harm reduction on the blockchain. He didn't really give a shit about users. And with Ordinals, it really was, I want to create the best protocol for digital art that there ever could be.
Yep.
Yeah, I think coming back to art, you know, I'm having this aha moment as we're talking. Coming back to art may be the bootstrapping, you know, that may be part of the bootstrapping from a market's perspective, right? Yeah. Do you have a point of view about what kind of art you'd like to see come back to Bitcoin? Do you think that Bitcoin is best suited for any particular types of digital art, in your opinion?
The gen art stuff is super, super interesting to me. I love the work of like Harto, Lifo Fifo,
Yeah.
Otto, Lemon Haze. Like I think all of their work is really, really incredible. There's many others out there as well, but I think that
they're hanging in too. They're still
in there, and they're still there and creating collections. And I think they deserve way more attention.
Yeah.
For the work that they do, and especially like Lifo for like all of the stuff that he's done from an infrastructure standpoint.
100%.
He has continued the same effort and motivation and passion behind his work through the entire downtrend, and you know that speaks volumes. Like all these people deserve way more just like applause for what they've done, what they've contributed, and how they continue to show up every day, just first and foremost. But with what I think would be super interesting, and some of these artists have done this, is like creating living work that lives on the blockchain but evolves based on things like block height or different hash functions. And I think the whole recursive endpoint sort of thing is really, really fascinating with respect to what you could ultimately create with gen art or this dynamic sort of living art on Bitcoin. And I would love to see that continue to be explored and pushed even more. And in tandem with like IRL and if we ever got like digital frames, that's where I think it's super interesting, where you can have the art and then you kind of have this like display that it's showing you like, hey, this block height, you know, altered this component of the artwork, just more descriptions about what's really happening.
Right.
And you can see some of that on Magic Eden, but it's just like bringing that to life so more people can see and understand why creating art on Bitcoin is
Special.
special.
Exactly. Like the relationship between what the blockchain, what the Bitcoin blockchain
100%.
uniquely can do in the creation of digital art. I mean,
100%.
that's my favorite subject, you know, like that's where I like to get nerdy.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you know what would be super sick? Like, I don't know how familiar you are, but there's like the BitX and some of these, like you have Block Clock, you have BitX, and all of these new like home mining like displays that will show you information about Bitcoin block height, and maybe it also mines Bitcoin. Well, it'd be super sick if you had one that was really more of like like a frame, a digital art frame, and it could show you like, here's this artwork that is also connected to block height or chains or changes based on block height or these other functions. So you still get all that same price data, but you also have an artwork that is living and breathing with those same elements. And that's
100%.
totally possible. That could be created. It's just, we need minds focused on that kind of creativity.
Yep.
Because that's real.
Yep.
That has real substance behind it, unlike a meme coin.
Right. Addressing Bitcoin as an actual art medium
100%.
rather than just the novelty of it's on Bitcoin, right?
Exactly.
Like that's enough. Like it's on Bitcoin. I'm saying, yeah, we know. But let's talk about why that's cool, why that's interesting. What can we do with that you can't do with Ethereum or Solana? On this sort of note of art versus PFPs, there is arguably the sort of like other side of the coin, for lack of a better word, that the sort of PFP gambling vibe maybe just fundamentally will get more attention in crypto. And that, you know, the art side of things is like niche and, you know, like people maybe don't want to get as nerdy about the tech as you and I might. What do you think about that? I mean, do you think that there's sort of a market reality for kind of the fine art on Bitcoin thesis, which people were talking about quite a bit a year and a half ago and has since almost completely died? Thoughts about that?
I think there's definitely space for both. I think PFPs tend to, you know, it's more of like a trading tool, typically, is how I think about it, right? Is like for people that are looking to flip, PFPs are a better game.
They're basically meme coins. They're basically giant meme coins.
They're basically meme coins. And I think, you know, there's a handful that really kind of maybe like cross a certain threshold where they become relevant enough where, you know, they have a high enough floor price and enough liquidity where you can have larger players start to participate. Because I think the challenge with like PFPs, and just to talk about that segment of the market, is like for bigger collectors that want to deploy more capital, they're not interested in buying like 100 PFPs for like 100,000 sats and trying to sit there and trade that and flip that. Like that's just not worth it. It makes a lot more sense to just buy one or two higher value assets that you have more conviction in and that have demonstrated liquidity and be a player in that space.
Right.
And it's really hard to cross that threshold, like insanely difficult. I think that the four main collections we have, Taproot Wizards, OMB Puppets, and Nerd Monks, and Cats, you know, the whole Taproot Wizards sort of umbrella.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned, yeah.
But I think those, it's going to be really hard to dethrone those. I always just see those as like, these are the blue chip PFP collections. There's, you know, there's opportunity for others as well. I think it's just going to be harder to ultimately catch up. And then you have collections like the Pizza Ninjas and other things, right, that people have interest in, but it's going to be hard to catch up.
Well, the historical meta, right, if you presume, and God, it's been so long since we've even talked about the historical meta, I feel like, as a community, but that was the meta for so long.
Totally.
But you can't recreate that now, right?
No.
Right. So, and those four collections, each in their own way, I would argue, are historical, again, in different ways. But they each have done, you know, were incredibly relevant at an incredibly important, critical, early time, and will probably maintain that. I mean, they will maintain that crowd. You can't dethrone that at this point. Do you see the early inscription meta ever coming back in a land where we hopefully make it through. I think eventually Ordinals will make it through, you know, if not this cycle and in a future cycle.
I think so.
Yeah, I just,
So.
but so do you think it'll be the early Ordinal meta, or do you think it'll be something else?
I think it'll still be the early ordinal meta, because the way that I kind of think about it is like, once you have these moments of heightened attention and you kind of get back into the bull market and people are making money again, it's kind of like, what is the asset that I can now go buy that really demonstrates, or, kind of like gives you that flex, right?
Hmm.
And I think for a lot of the people that were here in the early days, like everyone knows like the sub 1K or sub 10K, like early inscription collection. Everybody knows who they are, right? And those assets, owning those assets still carries, I think, some weight within those
They're not
early
selling.
collectors, and they're not selling.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that if there is another wealth creation event, you'll see those assets really start to sell for higher prices, or it'll just be harder to get. And every time we go through a cycle, it's just like
Harder and harder.
harder and harder.
Yeah.
Very few listings.
Right.
And as soon as
They're
one
hard capped.
sells, everyone's repricing their asset. So it's
Exactly.
really, really difficult to get them.
They're very, very hard capped. We see this with shrooms even recently. Every time there's like a little jump in Ordinals liquidity, a repricing happens in shrooms. Really, really interesting. But yeah, I am also hopeful, I guess, on the side of the historical meta, which I agree is probably going to always be a dominant meta anytime that Ordinals are up. I hope the fine art on Bitcoin, also has its day in the sun. What do you think needs to happen in order for fine art to become a meta on Bitcoin?
I think better discovery, and honestly, because there's a lot of great stuff out. It's impossible to find. I think on like Magic Eden, you can't even search by artist. So
Right.
you have to know the name of the collection.
Right.
So if I'm looking for like LIFO stuff or Harto stuff, Auto stuff, it's like impossible to find.
Can't even search by
honestly.
artist on Magic Eden.
Exactly.
It's crazy.
And something like Love Magic Eden, they've done a lot for Ordinals,
Yeah.
right? But like it's always going to be geared towards the trading. What's the quick flip? Because volume, right? Like that's how they make money.
Right. That's our incentive.
That's their incentive. Fine art is not about that. It's not about that. And so I think it requires a different type of marketplace. I think Gamma has done a pretty good job, and I know that they just did a refresh that I think is a lot more focused on the art, like focused on fine art and helping people discover art. So I think that that's great. I just think we need more of it, right? More avenues, more platforms.
I'd love to see more folks like Tropper,
Yeah.
like the singular.art. I mean, I remember as if it was like some long time ago. It really wasn't. But, these were companies that were really focused on building in the fine art world of Bitcoin, that, I think have been kind of sidelined, obviously, recently, and probably lost a ton of momentum as a result of the sort of degen gambling phase that we seem to be in. That's not working out very well.
I think virtual galleries too could also be a piece of infrastructure that could help push some of like the fine art piece. Like I'm thinking of back in like 2021 when you had the initial NFT run, a lot of the different metaverse plays, for better or for worse, were actually pretty instrumental for groups to just do like, here's my virtual gallery. Like you could literally go tour an artist's gallery and see all their work. And I think it's helpful for discovery, right? It also gives the artist an opportunity to curate their own experience. And I think with art, so much of it is the story, like what am I looking at? What was your creative process? How do you ultimately share that, right, with your viewer, your audience, or potential collector? And most of the marketplaces are not well suited to do that. But some of the virtual experiences are, where you could have an audio description of a piece and really curate it and bring into account all these other characteristics, and we just don't really have a lot of that.
Right. There's so many different ways that you could display digital art in digital environments.
Yes.
And, there's really no infra for that right now. We were on the path to building it, and then we kind of got sidelined by this whole Runes debacle. I want to take the conversation really quickly back to custody products, institutional grade custody products, cold storage you mentioned. These are sort of big companies. You mentioned Trezor, you mentioned Ledger. We're struggling to, get Bitcoin native assets just adopted by centralized exchanges. I can imagine there's sort of a similar challenge happening with the Trezors and the Ledgers of the world. Leonidas obviously sort of famously tweeted a few weeks ago and has been continuing to rant about the fact that, this is difficult to change unless somebody forks up the cash to pay for it. And because Ordinals doesn't have a big foundation and, kind of no big VC leadership, that's hard to find, right? Like
Totally.
something that we love about Ordinals is that it is very underground. Casey was just an independent developer building this thing. But the flip side of that is that there's not a ton of, kind of big check writers involved to, get infra on centralized exchanges or wallets, et cetera. Where does that lead? Like, what happens there? It feels like a rock and a hard place a little bit to me. How do you see that panning out? How do we get to be adopted by these sort of institutional infra players if we don't have these big, VC funded foundations behind us?
I agree. I think it's a massive challenge. I think I think a lot of it is just going to take time, unfortunately. Like, I think that a lot of these companies are aware it's just not a priority.
Because there's not enough money for them?
Because either there's no one banging the table or, I think the other thing that really holds the space back too is when you think about like the broader Bitcoin community, if you will, and you think about the companies, the people that have leverage or have a certain level of political clout, maybe, if you will, within that community, most of them are, I'd say, either anti like tokens, inscriptions, ordinals. They're not a fan of it. So what I mean by that is they're not going to go out of their way to promote or push for any kind of adoption.
The people who are building Bitcoin infra.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So
Leadership in Bitcoin is not
so that makes it even more challenging, right? So you're basically relying on this super, super small subset of people to go lobby and petition to these behemoth of companies, right? To ultimately provide support for these protocols. And they don't have the money to kind of throw around and say, hey, can you do this? Or they don't have the VCs at the table that are also invested in those same companies
screaming at them,
saying like, you need to support this and what have you. So I think that doesn't mean it's impossible. I think it just means it's going to take a lot longer of time at the end of the day.
And it's a chicken or the egg problem, right? Because the Bitcoin native assets ecosystem on the other side is small, right? I mean, I remember Casa, I don't know if you remember this, but Casa multisig, they supported ordinals almost right out the gate in like early 2023. I remember in like March, it was ETH Denver 2023. Casa was implementing support for ordinals for their multisig product.
Yep.
And then where did they go? What happened? And I don't think that was political pressure. I think that was like, are we getting enough out of this?
Right.
To make it worth our while to put the, the capital into keeping this built, So, so this is another sort of challenge that really can only be fixed by just slow, sustainable growth over time rather than these sort of bursts of like degen cyclical.
100%. But it's great to hear we have some champions. I mean, like Marathon with Slipstream has been huge, right? I mean,
yeah.
You don't need everyone.
Shout out to Mara, honestly.
Yeah. 100%. Shout out to them. I mean, they're still here, still, pushing the space forward. And I mean, things are still, like obviously ordinals still are, I'd say, frowned upon for the most part. But I think that sentiment in general has improved. I think in the early days, everyone thought this was like a massive sort of existential crisis for Bitcoin and we have spam and blah, blah, blah. I think all of that has kind of died down.
Right, everyone's calmed down.
Everyone's finally calmed down. And I think, not to say that people will turn out to love them, but I think that most people will just be like, this is fine. It's okay if this exists.
Right.
And I think we're slowly getting there. And I think as that happens, you'll see broader support. Like even just think about like Mempool providing like the inscription goggles on mempool.space. Like that's actually huge for analytics, just understanding what is actually going on chain and being able to track this activity. And they did get a lot of pushback, but it's incredible for them to just come out and say, hey, like, you don't have to use the product. You can even turn it off. Like, it's fine. It's more important for us to understand what's actually happening on chain and to provide that perspective. It's fully opt-in. So you're not really hurting anyone by at least providing this as an option for the people that do care to pay attention to it.
Right. So, yeah, anything else that you feel like, I mean, we've sort of, I think, covered a fair amount of the problem, so to speak, like what went wrong here. We're kind of getting into how to fix it. We've been sort of going down that rabbit hole. Number one, just kind of let the runes go is sort of the TLDR on that one, and pivot, right? Come back to ordinals, actually refocus, recenter on ordinals, which is something that Bitcoin is uniquely good at, and that we could really dominate and own. I mean, that was, I think, another kind of key moment of reckoning for me, or something that makes me think these assets are undervalued, is that at one point, NodeMonks was the second largest market cap NFT collection under CryptoPunks. And now, you have, I mean, you were telling me this, you have so many collections that are
Adlaz and
right. I mean, Bored Apes is like,
Apes.
beating NodeMonks right now. And Bored Apes are, relatively speaking to Ethereum collections, not doing so hot. So yeah, I'm kind of curious to see. This feels like, okay, there's got to be a rebalancing at some point.
Totally.
In the NFT ecosystem specifically. Do you see NFTs, like a re-emergence of NFTs in general, as a potential catalyst for ordinals?
Tough to say, because I think NFTs on like Ethereum have held up pretty well, like at least relative to like Bitcoin. Like NFTs on Solana, the top collections have all outperformed Bitcoin's top collections recently.
They did take a huge jump.
Huge hit.
Yeah.
But they've overall, I would say, fared much better. And I think that people on those chains, like, they know what they like, and the things that have sort of like a consensus view around like what's important, generally holds its value relatively well, which I think is encouraging. I think that it's possible we see a run in NFTs, but I think it's just going to be more challenged because it's the fragmentation of everything now, right? It's like you've got like NFTs compete with meme coins for attention and liquidity, and now you're also competing across multiple chains.
This would be an issue for all of crypto. All of non-Bitcoin crypto right now is arguably suffering from
100%.
the disease of fragmentation.
So the market is ultimately going to have to kind of decide, like, what do we really like? You know what I mean? At least for the
What do we let die?
What do we let die, and what do we keep around?
This is the TLDR, right? We've got to like figure out what actually matters and focus on those things and let the losers wither away.
100%. 100%. There's not enough to go around.
Yeah, exactly. Well, at least we have a clear thesis in this conversation. Yeah, anything else that we want to cover in terms of what the ecosystem needs to do to get out of this funk that we're in?
I think, like, to put it as simple as I can, I think we just got to get back to having fun. Like, at the end of the day, like, the early days of Ordinals were like the most fun ever. I don't know what, it just felt like this super unique sort of period of time or moment in time where like every day you're just sort of like excited to see, oh, there's this new collection, or like there's some new improvement, or like this company is providing support, or whatever it is, right? Like you're just kind of like excited to see the new thing that was coming to kind of push the space forward. And here's how we're going to make this better. And it was just like a super fun time, in my opinion. And like the spreadsheet days, you were there for the spreadsheet days, legendary period of time. But that was just like a lot of fun.
I felt high the whole time.
Yeah, it was a good time. Good time, good vibes. I think we got to get back to that. Runes, I think, has been just really hard for everyone.
A soul crusher.
It's been soul crushing. I don't think anybody's really having fun with runes. I think we got to go back to the art and have fun with creating art, interesting experiences, pushing the boundaries of the protocol, finding new and clever ways that we're creating like these interesting concepts and ways to do things. I think we got to get back to that. And I think we got to put the spotlight on that.
Yeah.
The timeline needs to be about art, about people building things, about people sharing things, not about exchange listings for my rune bags or whatever it is. Like, or just crying because, you know, there's no volume, there's no liquidity, and you're down 20% again today.
I know. Sometimes I'm just like having these conversations about runes, and especially as like a former Bitcoin maxi / pretty Bitcoin sympathetic person, I'm like, why am I here? Like, how did I get here? Like, how did I get here having these conversations about these like aggressively bad shit coins? But anyway, what do you think is the role of influencers in all of this? KOLs, as they say.
I mean, they definitely control the narrative, right? I mean, the timeline, for better or for worse, right, drives a lot of the vibe and feels in the space, right? So, if the influencers are putting more attention towards a specific project or a certain idea, it's definitely going to have some weight because there's a lot of people that do ultimately are, because it's a lot of sentiment and swing trading. So like a lot of people are looking at these things as indicators or what people are talking about as indicators. So they definitely play a role. I think in ordinals, we don't have many influencers at the end of the day.
Very small number.
Very small number. I think we could use more diversity of perspectives, ideas, narratives, talking points, focus areas.
We probably have less than 5 like KOLs and ordinals with more than 100,000 followers on Twitter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. I feel like half of it is like if one of the Ethereum big influencers is like all of a sudden focused on
Puppets.
puppets or whatever. Like that's what's like driving a lot of the attention. I think we just need more people that were here that but have been of our space, like been around, understand it, kind of driving attention and kind of telling the story and just more diversity, right? And I think more focus on like art, more art specific focused influencers, if you will, or content, certainly.
Yeah. Do you think that there's been some irresponsibility on the part of certain influencers in this space, or is this just the way the cookie crumbles? These influencers are ultimately just traders, and it's the responsibility of retail to recognize that they're just pumping their own bags.
It's tough. I think it is kind of more on the retail investors, traders to just kind of listen to everything with a grain of salt, right?
Yeah.
I think it's hard to get like a truly unbiased, right? Like
Human being.
yeah, like especially like
In this space?
in this space, 1000%. But at the end of the day, that's why I think like diversity could help. But yeah, there's a lot of politics, of course, at stake with that.
Right. Right. You can't even say the word BRC20 on the Ordinal show, basically.
Yeah, which is, and I mean, it makes it tough. It's kind of like, well, you could just go start your own thing, but I mean, not everybody wants to be an influencer, and it also takes
it's a lot of work. Yeah. They capitalized, Ordinal show in particular capitalized on some big early adopter luck, right? So some people got lucky, minting the right thing at the right time. I would argue that Leo and Trevor, and they would probably say, I've heard them say this too, or at least Trevor would say they got lucky, starting a media company at the right time, So yeah, there's a lot of luck involved in that as well.
Totally. I also kind of wish like some of the like more traditional like NFT media platforms did a better job of covering ordinals as well. Because I also think like, granted, they were originally built to focus on like Ethereum based NFTs. Some of them have tried to cover the ordinal space to a degree, but clearly like they're really lacking in that area with respect to awareness of what's going on, what's happening. I saw a like top 10 sales list that omitted like 5 different inscription sales. of just like top digital like collectible or asset sales from 2024.
Oh, wow.
And it missed like inscription number 3, which is like the
Oh, it
duck
just
thingy.
exceeded it.
Yeah, well, they just like didn't even
didn't
know.
know.
They just didn't know. And like that's what I'm saying. Like the state of coverage for like Bitcoin art ordinals, it's terrible.
Yeah.
Terrible.
Yeah.
So like there's just so much low-hanging fruit that I see on that function, like in that perspective that I think would help sort of counterbalance maybe some of the influencers that we have in ordinals, or at least provide, other perspectives, other outlets.
Yeah, we've got to aggregate all of your research pseudonyms so that, we can like really like non-fragment the attention to the good art researcher.
I mean, half of my motivation for some of that is just like, I would like to see this, so I'm just gonna go do it. But like, it does take a shit ton of time.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
A
It's a lot
lot
of work.
of work. Yeah, and you have a real job.
It's hard to keep up with that stuff and do it consistently, but I do like to just try to put it out there for people when I get some time.
Yeah.
But it is a lot.
Yeah. Well, I'm very grateful. I love all of your NIM work. I wish I could link to it, but we'll leave you NIM. Maybe some people will speculate on who Beezy really is. Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much. This was so fun. Like, and I hope, again, gave folks a little bit of, didn't like completely trash the hopes of folks, but was, like a real honest conversation about what we need to do if we're to save this space. Any kind of final thoughts on that, right? Like, what do you think, folks, what's the one takeaway that you want folks to walk away from this interview internalizing as far as how we can turn the space around from where it is right now?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like one of those moments in time where you have to kind of look yourself in the mirror, right? And be honest, right, about the state of things, what you're seeing. We need a little bit less copium and hopium in the space, and say, if we're going to kind of turn this around, you've got to look at, what's real, what's real, and how can I build on what has been working or what has worked. And I think now is sort of one of those moments in time for the broader community to just kind of be honest and open about maybe where we got a little bit sidetracked, right? Like Runes was really like the side quest.
It was a side
It was 1000% the side quest.
Yeah.
Now I think we did that, right? But like now it's time to get back on track. And I think lean back into those key things that we talked about in this podcast to kind of right the ship and just
Come back to the art.
exactly, come back to art, come back to
Come back to what we do well. Come back to
Exactly.
ordinals.
Yes.
Amen. Thanks, Beezy. Cool.